Shabbat Shalom. If you would like to move into the forbidden middle section, you are now welcome to. And by the way, the Talmud teaches that Mashiach will come when everybody knows everybody else's place in synagogue. And I knew of all the things that were difficult this week, this might actually rank amongst the top of like moving people from their normal places. Talk about adding insult to injury, I apologize. So I got an email this week. I got many emails this week. I'm sure all of you did as well. And the email basically said, in a very polite form, by the way, which is the email was sort of like, why? To me as a rabbi, what is the point? This is a person who was feeling, whose professional and personal identities are deeply wrapped up in a fight for justice in this world, and who feels so badly beaten and so dispirited by the tenor of the country right now, that their question for me was, what's the point? And one of the things I want to do is I want to honor that question. I want to honor the moment of profound disappointment, a feeling of deep, deep betrayal, of feeling like, wait a second, we're back here again, but worse this time, that many people are feeling. Without presuming what political opinions, I know what political opinions people have. I can see it on your faces, and not least because of those emails and because of the way that people communicate with me. And so when the person saw me, read me write a letter to the community that says, what do you do right now? You study Torah, you keep Shabbos, you find what's made to do mitzvahs, and you find love, you find chesed, and you do it to other people. Their reasonable question was, to what end? And what's the point? By the way, a rabbi by the name of Eliezer Berkowitz was the first one to really sort of draw into clear focus the paradox of faith in the most difficult moments, because he says when it comes to traumatic experiences, if someone loses their faith, and let me for a moment draw that as broadly as possible. I speak in the language of Torah because I am a rabbi, and theoretically you hired me to do that. But I don't believe that I'm naive, and I understand that faith is a fundamental spiritual faculty of human beings that gets applied across a wide variety of subjects. I know plenty of people who have like faith in their atheistic socialism that feels very similar to me. In fact, like I often found the sort of Jewish socialist movement like to feel very familiar. It was just sort of like, instead of saying God, it was like, we don't like that or that, you know, but it was like very similar language. It's not a new idea. So I need to sort of just say that faith is something that spans what goes on in this room. It's what goes on in every room, in every heart. And what Rabbi Berkowitz said is like when someone goes through deeply traumatic, or people go through deeply traumatic things, and they lose their faith, who are you to tell them that they were wrong to do so? And if they go through deeply traumatic experiences and they gain their faith, keep their faith, who are you to tell them they were wrong? So what I'm talking about is something deeply personal in a way that I don't feel like I can completely, I'm not here to gainsay how people are feeling. And yet I want to tell you why I said in the morning, I knew I needed to be here this morning. I wanted to be here this morning, why I wrote that letter to you. In this parsha, what the rabbis want to know more than anything else is why Abraham and Sarah? Why them? The Torah is a frustrating book because it rarely bothers to explain itself, ever. Oh, by the way, you shouldn't wear wool and linen? You don't understand why? Tough. Really, the character that we get the most background about is Joseph. He's the longest single narrative in the Torah, and we understand him. I believe Rabbi Hirsch is going to be actually teaching a class on Joseph in the winter, which I was really excited to see. But Joseph, we really get a sense of his psychology, but all we know is that Abraham is the son of Terach and the brother of Nahor and the husband of Sarai, who's not yet Sarah yet. He's not even Abraham, he's Avram. And then we hear God say to Abraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha lemod. Go you from your land and from your homeland and from your father's house to the land I will show you. And the rabbis want to know, who is this man? Why him? Why them? And my favorite midrash, the one that sort of blesses me and haunts me in equal measure, is the midrash of the palace in the desert. Is anyone familiar with this? Yeah, I see a couple of heads nodding, not many, but Ethan knows. There's a few people. Matt knows. I saw a hand over here as well. There's this beautiful midrash. Why Abraham? Is because Abraham is walking along, apparently in the desert, and all of a sudden sees a palace. And the palace is doleket, which means it's burning. Now, the problem is that the word doleket is a word they use for candles. It neither means a forest fire, nor does it mean, just sort of illuminated. And so we don't really know exactly what it means that the palace is burning. And Abraham looks at this palace and he says, I see this palace. Who is responsible for it? And the Midrash says it was at that point in time that the Holy One peeked through, literally sort of peeked through the door, the keyhole at Abraham, and said, Lech lecha me'artzecha, and sort of says to him, you're the one, Abraham. Now, if you don't understand my profound love for this Midrash, I can understand, because on first glance, it's incredibly bizarre. Here is the way that the classic commentators understand it, is that Abraham is passing by something that, at least in one reading, is absolutely beautiful, filled with light, deeply illuminated. And rather than saying, oh, it's so lovely, oh, it's so wonderful, oh, it's so fantastic, he asks, I want to meet the person responsible for this beauty. And in the second reading of it, Abraham comes across this palace and he sees chaos. The palace is burning. And he says, I want to meet the person responsible for this chaos. And it was that spiritual orientation, neither to run around like a chicken with his head cut off, right? Nor, by the way, to add fuel to the fire, nor simply to benefit from it or to take it as his own, but to ask the question, who is responsible here? That seems to make Abraham the one. Forgive me, by the way, our tradition, by the way, is a deeply patriarchal tradition, even though it makes incredible space for our foremothers. And I wish, by the way, that there was an equivalent midrash about Sarah and Sarai. Her name, by the way, means princess, but in Hebrew, that's not an insult, in the way that in English it might be a little bit. Somebody really liked that one. There's a commentator who comes along. His name's Eitz Yosef. He lives in the 19th century in Bialystok. That's about where my family is from, so I'm partial to him. And he says, for centuries and centuries and centuries, I'm going to tell you, we went back and forth about this midrash. Was the palace illuminated or was it burning? Was it beautiful or was it a dumpster fire? And he says, finally, I can tell you there's a correct reading of this midrash, a correct interpretation. He says the correct interpretation is, it was a garbage fire. A garbage fire. It was a disaster. How does he know? He says because if you come across a temple that's a palace that's beautiful and stunning, it's very easy to believe in a God of the universe who creates beautiful things. It takes strength and something else to come across something that's a total disaster and say, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I still have faith. He says there's no advantage to someone saying, wow, isn't this amazing? It gives me faith in the universe. He says this distinction that made Avram, that made Abraham, is that he could see in the middle of chaos faith. He says a person like that you should pay attention to. I am not yet a person like that. The days are okay, but I wake up in the middle of the night. It's about 2:45 every night. And I worry. for the kids. And for other people's kids too. And I know that you're doing the same, many of you. And so the question is, on a very basic level, is sort of just like, what do we do now? As individuals, as a community, as a spiritual community, how do we proceed? What comes next? You know, like, what's sort of interesting is that from what I understand, the division, the gap in the percentage of the popular vote was about 1.5%. So it's really a divided country that we live in. And yet it was a resounding victory for Republicans. And so the question is, for those people who are very worried about what that means, what happens now? I'm sure one day I will be the rabbi who can tell you the answer to that. Today is not that day. But what I'm looking into your eyes and asking you to consider is less what will you do, and more who do you want to be? Because I think one presumes the other, you know? And to be honest with you, I don't, this isn't, the country is not an empty palette for us to, apply our brushstrokes as we see fit. I mean, if anything, that I hope we sort of learn that lesson in this particular election, that we are a pastiche of people who deeply disagree with each other and are also, by the way, quite worried about, on multiple sides, about the future of the world. And extreme times tend to make for extreme people and extreme decisions. And there's a lot of division and a lot of uproar. It's not the first time in human history that this has ever happened. And I'm not saying to sugarcoat any of it. And yet, who do you want to be? I want to tell you about my mother-in-law. Has anyone here had the opportunity to meet my mother-in-law? Yeah, she's very memorable. A tall woman with a deep, thick Russian accent. You can slather it like jam on bread. And I'm very glad that she's in my children's life. She, amongst other things, had to, I think, requalify as a physician for her residency 3 times in her life, in Russia and Israel and the United States. Right? She raised 3 children in 2 marriages on 3 continents, and somehow is really one of the most positive people I know. And she has very little sense of irony, which she will tell you herself. And soon after I met her, I was in her kitchen. My wife and I were still dating. And for some reason, she looked at me and said to me, "We've had 15 generations of rabbis in this family. You're nothing special." She meant every word of that. I was strangely very enheartened by that comment. Because she was right. I am nothing special. She saw through me. She understood what was happening to me. And what I appreciate about my mother-in-law is when I saw her, I saw a woman of strength and resilience. I remember, by the way, I was complaining about something at the office, and she's the type of person, if you're complaining about something local and real and meaningful and you just want some validation and it's not the end of the world, she's like, "I'm just going to tell you right now it wasn't as bad as communism," and then go back to making soup. That's her style. And she wasn't joking, she meant it. She's sort of like... She told me that when she was a kid, her mother, who was also a surgeon, she grew up in the Ural Mountains, really in the middle of nowhere. They had fled from Moscow because I think the KGB had her father on a list. It wasn't like the worst kind of list, but he wanted to be a physician, he wanted to live free, so the records weren't as good in the Urals, so they went that way, and they were both physicians there. But she was a really big deal. She was sort of in charge of general surgery for the whole... She had her own plane. That was her big deal. And she would fly from place to place doing surgeries, and then she would do the brisses, the circumcisions, at night in secret. And my mother-in-law's grandfather, who actually emigrated into the Soviet Union so that he could be with his son, 2 sons, who had lost his wife in a complex relationship, he was the one that would tell her the stories of the Torah and teach her Yiddish, behind closed doors. And from such people, I learned that strength in difficult times is not only possible, but something I think that is deeply, deeply admirable. I'm not saying that this time is like that. I'm not. I doubt it will be. I don't think it's going to be great, but I doubt it will be. But deeply, the question is sort of like, who do you want to be, and how do you want to deal with your betrayal, your sense of betrayal? I came away from the election not feeling particularly betrayed or surprised. By the way, I'm not claiming that that's the way to be. I think that, people had the whole spectrum of reactions to it. But I think that amongst many people, there is a deep sense of, I thought our country was a different group of people, that they were better, that they were more righteous than this voting track record, according to many of our opinions, many of your opinions, indicated. I believed in America, and I think a lot of people are asking themselves the question, do I still? Again, a fair question. But I've been a rabbi for a while now, and what I've learned about human beings is that we are close to the angels and little better than devils. We are geniuses, and we have the capacity to make the worst possible decisions ever, and we do regularly. All the time. We think things are in our best interest, and we follow them, and they often just, they backfire in spectacular fashion. We think we know what we're talking about, and we rarely do. And by the way, I'm not actually saying this to sort of say, like, I'm not asking you to go on a journey of self-discovery about if you were a liberal or a progressive, where you were deeply wrong in this election. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I'm asking you to shed your naivete about who human beings really are and how we react when we're under deep, deep, deep pressure. Environmental pressure, economic pressure, geopolitical pressure, individual pressure, pressure. And it's a pressure time in which to live. And for whatever reason, even though in 2016 I was in fundamental shock, for some reason I had shed that by the time that I had come here. And yes, by the way, I still do have a deep faith. And I guess I'm going to ask you to do the same. The first thing I want you to have is faith in yourself. By the way, don't take this the wrong way, you're so perfect, everyone could use a little bit of adjustment, And in fact, I hope adjustment comes. What do we need to learn? What do we need to change? I mean, clearly the way that we think and live and advocate and has to evolve in some sort of a way. I don't know what it is. I think maybe many of you know better than I do. I have no idea what it is. But, to not evolve at all and to sort of do the same things is, many people say, the definition of insanity. It's not bad to change. And yet for those of you who had as your moral North Stars the kinds of values that you deeply believe in, why should you change those? Just because we lost doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. Are they still worth fighting for? Ask yourself. And if the answer is yes, then fight. Even where we may not win. So please have faith in your moral orientation. The second thing I want you to do is to have faith in each other. And it's like this. There are many, many people here who are going to have a very difficult time after the change in administration. Many of you work in the civil service, right? Many of you have jobs that will change radically. You've been through this once before. I was here in 2016 too. But the person sitting next to you, they care about you. They have cared about you. They've cared about you for decades. And I want you to know that this community, I give my word, will be a place of support and succor for people who are going through a really difficult time. Succor, S-U-C-C-O-R. The last ask I have you to have is a very, very difficult one. It's going to be a very tough one. It's going to sound harsh on your ears, and it's going to hurt. I want you to have faith in the future. In the future. Anybody else grew up in the 90s? Listen to the Fugees? The record is not over yet. It's not. Day after day, month after month, year on the year, we go forward, time goes on. And the idea that somehow that there is an end to history is probably the thing that we most need to sort of let go. Right? We have no choice but to move forward into a history, into a future that's coming. And so therefore I ask you to think not only of this moment, but of the next moment, and not only the next moment, but in years from now moment. And if it's a 30-year plan, so be it. We've got the time. What Avram was willing to do, what he was able to do, is to see in the midst of conflagration the possibility of the future. And I'm asking you to do that too. I'm not telling you that it's going to be rosy. I'm not trying to take away from those of you who feel vulnerable and worried at the moment, because I understand that a lot of that vulnerability and fear is for real. And yet, I want this to be a place, a spiritual home, that understands that there is yet more to come. There's always yet more to come. And I'm not willing to give up on it yet. Avram leaves his home. He leaves everything he knows. He was oppressed by a king called Nimrod. He had to basically create a new religion. He makes mistake after mistake after mistake. He gets to Israel. He goes to Egypt. He pretends his wife is his sister. He goes back to Israel. He goes back down to Egypt, pretends that his wife's his sister again. It's a very confusing situation. He has 2 sons. They don't get along with each other. He has 2 wives. They don't get along with each other. One he banishes. She comes back. Then he banishes her again. And then the story does repeat itself, and yet we call him Ish Elohim, the man of faith. And I think that emunah is still there for us. I ask you to relinquish not your brokenness, not your pain, not your anger, not your suffering, not your worry about the future, not your anxiety about your friends, not your anxiety about your children. I ask you to give none of that up. The only thing I ask you to hold on to is the idea that the values that you have fought for are still worth fighting for, and that the record is not over yet. Into the future we go. Let's do it together. Shabbat shalom.